about water and urban places. This is Ideanthro. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Ideanthro. On today's episode, we're going to be delving into this topic that we've touched on a little bit before, but we've got this idea of water-sensitive urban design, or in this instance, SUDS, as it's known in the UK, or similarly known in the UK. And we've been beginning to apply this. We've been getting lots of traction in new development, although slightly pigeonholed down the route of bioretention only. But we're going, okay, how do we take the next step in our policies and our practices to get this really well embedded and get it embedded holistically? So all the different things that could make a city water sensitive are being done and being implemented. On today's episode, we have a guest from the UK, Bob Bray. Bob, welcome along. The reason I've asked Bob along is that he is very well known and has a lot of experience in the UK with implementation of SUDS and holistic implementation of SUDS, so sustainable urban drainage systems. And I've reached out to Bob today to have a chat about, okay, what has been the implementation and the practice of SUDS like in the UK? And maybe we can compare and contrast that a little bit with Australia and see what we can learn back and forth, maybe some ideas that we can bring back from that. So that's the context of today's episode. Bob, why don't I give you a second? Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about kind of where you come at this industry from, and we can get into this conversation from there.
Righto. Well, to start off, I'm a landscape architect, so that's where I'm coming from. And I came across this whole business in 1996 when there was a big presentation in Coventry, at Coventry University, and it was introducing what they then called a stormwater management, or BMPs, because it was generally, the ideas were coming from the States, but the impetus was basically from a chap called Brian Darcy, from what was then, from what became Scottish Environment Protection Agency, on a very big project up in Dunfermline, known as the DEX development. So there was clearly this thing had been germinating over a number of years, but I think it would be fair to say that's when it really kicked off, and I was very fortunate to be in the beginning of it. So there were all these examples from the States, and most of them were landscape based, and they were most of them a mixture of filter strips, swales, filter drains, basins, ponds, wetlands, the sort of thing, the sort of palettes that you would expect or such to use as standard bits of kit. There wasn't very much on permeable pavement, but that was developed very much at that time at Coventry University through a guy called Professor Pratt. And I should imagine within, almost at that time, the whole concept of permeable surfacing came rapidly into view, really. So, firstly, I managed to, I don't know, by hook or by crook or persuasion, should we say, I managed to do a motorway service area within 12 months of that meeting. And that was the first one. And all of that information came from the States, all the guidance, if you like, design guidance came from the States. And it was quite clear there that the ideas of management trained of using techniques in sequence, in series, if you like, and by and large the aspirations were quite clear, and it was quite clear that this should be a surface, at or near the surface sort of technique, and that it should use a number of different techniques. There wasn't a huge amount of emphasis on integrating it into development at that time. And I suppose I use the term dedicated SUDS for what tended to be done, and which is often still done, is where you collect the stormwater and transfer it to an area where it is then looked after, if you like, in a series of swales and basins and whatever, what have you. Now that still is quite a common approach. But as we came on, I suppose the chronology is that in 2000 we had our first SUDS manual here, and SUDS was the acronym of Sustainable Urban Drainage Systems, is now Sustainable Drainage Systems. And of course, it does we do get criticised a little bit because
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people say, well, we shouldn't be using the word drainage because that's sewers, isn't it? But anyway, we're lumbered with that. We've got the word suds. From there on, I started working through local authorities initially, and it was local authorities who had a champion in. So it was an individual within that local authority, and the whole science work, if you like, at that stage was about passionate individuals who wanted to make something happen.
Yep.
So 2000 is the first SUDS manual. So we get a SUDS manual in 2000, which gives us the basic approach to managing water, if you like, rainfall. And I mean, that was seminal, really, because that suddenly gave credibility, and it was written by an organisation, Paul Schaffer, you mentioned earlier on. Paul Schaffer works for CIRIA, I don't remember what the acronym means, but basically they're representing the construction industry in Britain.
Yep.
So it had traction, to use your word, as because it was being promoted then by a national body. In my own personal experience, it was still very much based around the enthusiasm of individuals.
Mm-hmm.
So I was there on my second motorway service area. I had my first housing scheme it was generated essentially because it was a co-housing scheme, so people there were interested in sustainability. And a lot of schools, and that was one individual at Worcestershire County Council who wanted sustainable development, and he saw SUDS as part of that.
Yep.
So in a funny sort of way, it was still very much based on people. There was little in the way of, there was no dedicated lawmaking at that time. So legislation was hardly there at all. All there was a recognition of that it was a good thing, and the basic design criteria were in this first manual.
Okay, so can I ask a question? What was the quality in terms of both, maybe like technical quality of work being delivered? Like what was it on the ground? What was the quality of that product, and how much was it? Like how much innovation was occurring at that point in what people were building on the ground? I'm tying this back into when I look back at the similar time in Australia. What was the quality of the work and the innovation going on?
Well, this is something which I've got to be very careful about, because where SUDS was being required of the engineering community,
mm-hmm.
the design was very, very basic.
Okay.
So you would have water generally collected by gullies and discharged into a basin of some description, or sometimes collected by swam. But very simplistic. The designs were very simplistic, and they were add-on, if you like. They were add-on systems.
Yeah.
And I mean, the real tragedy is that very many of what we still see are very basic systems. In fact, I spoke to a local authority not long ago, and they were saying 90% of what we are looking at is pipes to pond solutions, or even worse, pipe to tank solutions.
Yeah.
And that whole, because that's just balancing ponds, that's old technology, that's pre-SUDS, if you like.
Gotcha.
So there were very few examples, and I have to, if I'm honest, they were generally by landscape architects or landscape architects were involved in these, where the schemes had been integrated into the development footprint, if you like, rather than peripheral to it.
Yeah.
Now, it was a very slow genesis. Now, I was very fortunate. I'm trying not to be too English modesty. I'll throw that out the window for the moment. I would say that those schemes that we did early on, the reason that we have managed to survive for 20 odd years just designing SUDS schemes is because we bridged that gap between the pure functionality of basins and swine houses and wetlands and ponds with integrating these things into development, so they actually contribute to that development. Now, where that mental shift, I mean, it was always there with me because I'm a landscape architect and it was what I wanted to do. I've worked with water for a long time. I've been very interested in water in the landscape for a long time. But if you then, for many people, the work was being generated it's not surprising that you get very basic
Yeah.
such arrangements.
And this sounds a lot like home. So, you know, when I reflect back onto, because I'm relatively new to the industry compared to some others, but when I reflect back on what I understand and have heard on, say, the early 2000s of water-sensitive urban design in Australia, there was a lot of innovation and there was a lot of really good quality work occurred at that point. Some poor quality stuff as well, but the good stuff came out of teams that included both the landscape architecture side and the water engineering side working together. But the challenge has been more recently, as we've essentially, as you just said to people, can you please do SUDS or can you please do WUSID, is how to convert the good quality work into that paradigm and not just have it be that, I better look at the manual and stick a pipe in. And
part of the problem here, for instance, is that although we have what we used to call the SUDS triangle, now 4 pillars of SUDS, if you like, which is quantity and quality with amenity and biodiversity,
mm-hmm.
The only driver at the moment is flooding.
Yep.
So in the early days, people were idealistic, and the idealism, if you like, was an integrated water management. So all the integrated water management was new. Those ideas were around pre-2000. But once SUDS was seen as an effective way of managing flood or water quantity,
yep.
That, if you like, that priority began to impact on how things were designed. So for instance, the manufacturing industry suddenly realised that if you could make cheap plastic tanks,
mm-hmm.
in terms of design terms, it's very much simpler than designing a SUD system.
Gotcha.
So you just get a pipe and put all your water into a big tank, you meet the quantity requirements, and who's going to check that you've met your quality requirements? Who's going to check that you've met your amenity and biodiversity requirements? So it was almost a series of accidental occurrences, which meant that the original aspirations of the early thinkers about this were, if you like, submerged under this objective. We had some very serious in 2007, and flooding became a real driver. So it's almost as though it didn't matter how you manage the water, and a lot of people said, it's much easier to do it on the surface, it's much easier. So we've got the country is littered with bomb craters or underground sort of plastic or concrete tanks, which are called SUDS. They don't meet the criteria of SUDS,
yep.
either in terms of quality and biodiversity requirements, nor are they integrated into the development. But they're seen as solving the flooding problem.
And this parallels with what I see from the Australian story, but in our case, the driver was quality. So in our case, virtually no one would consider giving, flood prevention, like giving credit for flood prevention to something that would typically be water sensitive urban design. But the story's the same in that we had this really strong water quality driver. It arose in certain parts of the country after recognition that the bays downstream of, particularly of Melbourne and Brisbane, were being impacted. And so water quality came up as this major driver, and amenity and the like kind of fell off to the side of that. Okay, let's start. Go.
After making Australians are reasonably sort of, you're outdoor sort of guys, right? You like swimming in nice warm water. We don't have
Sure.
But what we are obsessed with is property values.
Mm-hmm.
So it's flooding as the driver for us, because property values affected over time in some ways on the flood risk register.
Gotcha.
So, and a lot of retrofitting is driven by getting people off the flood risk register rather than managing rainfall in a holistic fashion.
Yeah, although it struck me recently when I was in the Netherlands how, so the driver in the Netherlands for things that look like water sensitive urban design is the flood side of things, but how much of it was still very similar. Like, it's all the same techniques. No matter where you go in the world, we see all the same techniques, whether it's rain gardens, whether it's permeable paving, whether it's such and such and such. it did strike me at that point that I was like, well, if it's, if there's enough certainty and it's good enough for the Netherlands to give credit for flooding, why does Australia not give credit for flooding to these things either? But it's interesting.
I'm surprised that has been that way. Although, of course, in the States, it was the notorious sort of river catching fire for 4 days that gave rise to the Water Act.
Yep.
And plus, so clearly it was water quality in the States, and it's one of the reasons that their system. When I've been to the States, some of their systems can be very attractive because they recognise that the motivation for doing this is water quality.
Yep.
However, they have their fair share of bomb craters, and part of that is because, and it's what's happened here, is because of political shenanigans, if you like, changes of political views about 2010. Instead of a legislation which was interested in having a better environment, we have a legislation who is interested in profit, and the thing that affects profit is flooding.
Yep.
And so if you look at the idea that there was originally going to be a very wide-ranging requirement for this sort of thing, the only legislative requirement for such now is a quantitative one, i.e. meeting a 1 in 100, 1 in 1 year return period storm events.
Yep.
The rest of it is all nice to have. But of course that plays into the hands of the developers, and it plays into the hands of the big engineering companies who say we can meet those criteria very cheaply, or we can meet these without putting effort into integrating these things into development.
Yep.
So it's a peculiar consequence of history, really, that's got us where we are now.
Yep.
In some ways, we are moving forward now. That may be another thing which we can talk about in a bit.
Well, let's go there, because I think there's a good takeaway point from that, which is essentially the case of, look, we get what the policy asks for. That's quite upfront, whether it's water quality first in Australia or water quantity first, as you've described in the UK. But what's happening now? What's happening more recently in this space?
Well, we've had a third manual published in 2015.
Okay.
Again, very much engineer oriented. It's got all of the other elements in there, but it's just interesting. You look at the quantity element of the publication, and it's say 100 pages. Quality goes down to about 20 pages, and amenity goes down to 2 pages, and biodiversity they can't spell it. So
yep.
So we still have that very high because of this obsession. Whereas early on, as I say, this obsession with quantity wasn't there. What I think is happening, and it's very difficult to talk about what's happening now, because that is no longer history.
Yeah.
We are about the present. But for instance, we're writing a design guide at the moment for a whole number of local authorities who are desperate to find hooks to make sure they get better quality design through the door, because they still get either pipes to ponds or pipes to boxes, and they can't say no if they haven't got some mechanism, if you like, to back them up.
Yep.
Now, if they were prepared to say that you had to meet these 4 sort of criteria equivalently, then they would have that strength to do that. But most people, there are very few designers in the game who are looking at this from a holistic point of view at the moment. So, of course, everybody says they are, but there's a handful of people who are doing this holistically, and most of them would be landscape architect based, because and this is a common view, is that engineers say ask a landscape architect to come in to make their scheme look pretty.
Yep.
So in no way is it integrated. This is just cosmetics, and really and I know quite a lot of landscape architects who are trying to get into this, but of course they're scared off by increasingly complex and difficult to understand engineering elements of this. So the engineering was very simple in 2000.
Yeah, okay.
It's now complicated. It requires modelling, and it requires knowledge that most landscape architects don't have. dozens of the engineers that make doing these systems without having any design skills. But you see, design skills aren't the same. You know, they're not numerical, and therefore, in a sense, you could. The industry is dominated at the moment by engineers responding to this. That's part of the issue, in my opinion, is that we're not dragging into whatever we like to say, a multidisciplinary approach, because it's still dominated by guys who can add up.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't previously considered that maybe by making these systems more and more complex and just more and more detail into how to optimize them to the nth degree, so to speak, how we might actually be cutting some other professions out of it who, you know, by their nature just work in different manners. It's not to say that one is better than the other, but they're just different approaches to working. I hadn't actually considered that we might be cutting.
Mathematics, you see, firstly, the terms that are used are quite exclusive. You have to make an effort to understand the terms that are being used at the end of where the quantity of things are being discussed. And then, of course, there's then modelling. So you need to be able to have expertise in modelling the outputs. And by and large, landscape architect practices don't have that. And most of them don't have access to it.
Yeah.
So they become dependent on the engineer, where the engineer feels that they're not dependent on the landscape architect.
Yeah.
So we're fortunate that we started off when the requirements were very simple. If we had the right return period and the right round about the right volume, round about the right flow rate, then everybody was pleased with what we were doing.
Yeah. So you've essentially learnt on the go, whereas anyone coming into it now has got this big high barrier of entry to jump in.
That's right.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah. And I know landscape architects would love to do this work, and they just say we can't break into it. Because the main thing that we've now got a regulator called the Local Flood Authority in each local planning authority.
Mm-hmm.
Most of those people come from an engineering background. So the questions they ask are not whether it's a good scheme, whether it's integrated, whether it looks good, whether a new can live in it, or whatever. They say, prove to us that there's going to be no flooding.
Yeah.
So that means, it implies, if you like, that you have to do the modelling, and that's what the scheme is judged on. Its ability to meet those parameters.
Yeah. So
we're used to jumping those hoops, but most creative designers are not used to doing that. Even in the multidisciplinary practices, it's still engineer-led. And I've spoken to people in the States, and it's exactly the same there.
Yeah, I would say it's exactly the same here. So, okay, before we started recording, you mentioned to me, so coming round onto the policy side of things, you said to me that like a lot of this work was initially led, like there was good work out of Scotland, but as it's become a little bit more mainstream in different parts of the UK, it's had its own different variations. So like the Scottish angle went a particular way, and more recently the Welsh angle's gone a certain way, and maybe England's gone another way. Can you talk to me a little bit about what's that looks like and what's that meant? And
well, Scotland led this thing, but the first schemes were in Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
And I was up there, I was doing it at the same time, and I was probably the only person doing it at that time, but the Scots were moving ahead. And all the initial, if you like, legwork was done by the Scots, to put credit in places due. I mean, the Big Dunfermline expansion area was absolutely critical to getting this going in Britain. It had its problems. The local authority wouldn't allow source control. They insisted on gully pots, and because they weren't confident that it wouldn't work, so they wanted enough conventional drainage in there. A typical sort of backup system, which meant that in many respects it didn't work. So it meant that pollution wasn't being intercepted properly, blah blah blah. And of course, it was largely designed by the engineers, so it's not pretty.
Mm-hmm.
So, for all the right reasons, the Scots then decided that adoption, that is, who looks after these systems, was a problem. Their water company is a publicly owned water company, and they managed to persuade the government to arrange that all sites should be adopted by the water company.
Okay.
And that stopped creative thinking dead in its tracks. because the water company set adoption standards. For instance, it will adopt a pond, but it won't adopt swale. So it'll adopt bits of the system.
Yeah, okay.
Because the classic sort of way an engineer looks at this is bits. They look at it as, oh, that's a swale, and this is a pond, and that's a pipe, and this is that and the other. And it always also got to the point where they then set standards like every water feature should have a fence around it. And they even got to the point where they were saying, well, we'll adopt up to the 1 in 30 year storm, but we're not obliged to adopt anything else. So somebody else will have to look for the basin where it goes to the 1 in 100 year storm.
Right.
This, because you were asking an institution who are all institutionalised to look after something which is a landscape.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a lot of unintended consequences. Now in England, it was almost the opposite. It's been a free-for-all, really. There were hardly any rules, really, which in some ways is good because it's allowed us to do what we want to do.
Yep.
But of course, there's very little backup. So most developers just ignore it.
Yep.
So they don't have to do it. They don't get criticised. Well, they certainly don't get prosecuted if they don't do it. They're increasingly having more difficult problem. Increasingly being asked for planning permission. But then, of course, they've got things like the highways. They have to get the highways adopted. They have to get the local highway authority to agree to the road design. Now, most highway authorities won't adopt things like permeable pavement. They won't adopt water from swales and basins into their highway drainage, etc., etc. So there's a real big problem at that level. And interestingly, the last group of players into the game, in a sense, the Welsh,
Mm-hmm.
appear to have gone down they probably looked at the Scots and the English and thought, well, they're making a complete mess of this.
Yep.
And they've actually adopted the bones, anyway, of what the ideal proposal was back in 2007, 8, 9.
Okay.
That is, you have what's called a SUDS approving body. The SUDS approving body approves SUDS schemes and is based on all of the 4 criteria. And their water company, which is also state-owned, whereas in England it's all privately owned,
Yep.
their water company has been sort of, not lent on, but I don't know what accident of history, they are very pro this, so they're prepared to adopt systems. So we're watching the Welsh scenario with wide eyes at the moment to see if they can get it to work.
Yeah, well,
None of the systems that we've got at the moment, England, Scotland and Wales, work well.
yeah.
So we're just hoping that this new, and it's only just been agreed by the Welsh government, which happens to be a Labour government, that they will go down this route, whereas our bunch of ne'er-do-wells who are Conservatives, they won't have anything to do with it. They've been obstructed right from the beginning. So it'll be very interesting to see how this goes.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like that'll be interesting to keep an eye on. And I mean, to a certain extent, like when I look at this, I go, like, in some respects, I look at, sustainable drainage systems, water sensitive urban design, and like, look, it should be easy. On the other hand, I look at it like, it's fundamentally a really, really different way of doing things and a really, really different change. So, yeah, and so for me, I'm like, you know what, it's actually not that surprising that we've got elements of it wrong, particularly the elements of how do we mainstream it and set up policy right. So part of me is like, you know what, on the one hand, we can sit here and shake our heads and be like, oh, I can't believe we got it wrong. But on the other hand, it's just a case of, you know what, it's really tough. We should just openly recognise that some stuff hasn't go so well and have another crack at it. And it's good if, in this instance, if the Welsh are the next ones having a crack at it in the UK, see how they go, learn from what does and doesn't work, and someone else can iterate. So,
but I suppose that the slow drip thing is that in England we are getting more and more people. So, for instance, in our practice, we are now getting people who are involved in urban renewal asking us to come in early in the design process, whereas before we were only being asked to come in and do sites in isolation.
yep,
We were very, very lucky that we hit 2 or 3 clients, for instance, with the school plan, and we had, we've been able on schools, whereas in other parts of the country, people saying, no water over my dead body, blah, we're not going to do this, just put it all in tanks.
yep,
We've been able to do really exciting water, swale mazes and water dropping down from the roof in water chains or water slides or whatever it is. And that's largely because we've got a track record with that particular local authority. Started off with simple schemes, and we've got more and more, if you like, integrated and complex and more interesting. But there are parts of this country where this isn't happening at all. So it's a very, very mixed picture.
Yep. Yeah. So it sounds like home. It strikes something that you said a minute ago reminded me of something that I've been considering recently, which is, and it seems like it's the yin and the yang of this, which is, it seems like everywhere there's this case of at least some good early examples going in, but when maybe there wasn't a lot of regulation around it, but there were passionate people managing to innovate and develop stuff early. And then in the Australian context, we quite rightly went, okay, that's good, but the rate of implementation is so low that we want to speed this up. And so we've tried to speed it up with regulation and been successful at that, but at the same time cut off the innovation tap at the same time. I think to a certain extent, the great challenge of the moment in this space is how do we keep the innovation tap running while also turning on the faucet of we need to do much, much, much more of it. How do we run them both at the same time? Because I can see how to run one or the other.
I can see that. I haven't really thought about it like that. But it does occur to me that at the moment, the regulation, which everybody thought this would be the way to get this happening, regulation is favouring the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
And it is preventing innovation because there's always, and you know the English are like, they'll make a rule about anything. And we've got millions of these bloody rules which stop us doing stuff. But I'm not sure it's quite as simple as that simple scenario, because there are interesting projects being introduced now.
Mm-hmm.
But I would suggest it's because some designers, I wouldn't use the word mainstream, I think that urban designers, architects, and people who are charged with the urban realm are beginning to see the opportunities that integrating water into the landscape is going to give them. I hope that's what it is.
Yep.
Certainly, looking at the work we've been doing recently, as I say, would you believe we did this job called Australia Road, and it was very, very interesting that although it was highway engineers who were asking us initially to look at it, they just wanted permeable pavement.
Mm-hmm.
We generated a whole urban renewal area, new piazza, new vehicle-free area, new planting, mixture of permanent pavement and rain gardens and what have you. And suddenly, the accolades they were getting, they were not used to getting highways, not used to getting accolades for doing nice work, you know.
Yep.
Suddenly they were big, what jolly good chaps they were, you know. And I think certainly in London that's moving, and it's certainly the case in Sheffield, where they've managed to move beyond that early phase. And if you look at the Greater Green project in Sheffield, you'll see that it's all urban renewal, and it's fabulous.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that you're right that when you legislate, you have to be careful to not cut off that tap of innovation, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
But I can't see that, particularly in Britain with a very conservative establishment, how you would get this without some form of regulation.
Yeah.
Our problem is that we don't know how to regulate without increasing the bureaucracy to almost toxic levels.
Yeah. And I suspect Australia's got a piece of that, having inherited our our governance and the like from Britain. Okay, so why don't we start to wrap this up? Is there any other, and I do have one final question for you, but before we go there, is there any other angle that you feel that we should delve into this from? Is there anything obvious that I haven't asked you that you're like, you know what, Jack, you should have said whatever?
Well, not really. I'm just thinking, as we speak, the thing that I've been really encouraged by recently is how positive the public react to this.
Okay.
And I don't think that we have engaged with ordinary people
Well, that's true. When I talk to people about it here, people conceptually get it. Sometimes when they see the stuff we're building, they're like, "What the heck is that?" But they're on board with the concept.
Yes.
Yep.
So there's no resistance from if you like, the general citizen. I don't think. I think it's an institutional problem, and it's an institutional problem on a number of levels. One of them is that professionals are not delivering what the public would expect them to deliver, which is a sustainable environment.
Yep.
And they're coming up with all sorts of silly reasons why not. Whether it's rules that they feel they can't get around, or whether it's they say, oh, it's too much bother. There's a whole... So it's the people who are stopping it happen will be a mixture of... the top level will be politicians saying this is the priority, or developers have been sort of bugging us envelopes full of brown, nice new notes, whatever it is. So we get to the point where there's a whole level of people at the bureaucratic or the organisational level who should be facilitating this and are actually obstructing it. Because ordinary people, I've never met, I can't remember ever meeting an ordinary citizen who, when you explain how it works to them, didn't see the point of it.
Yep. Yeah. I like it. That makes sense, and that rings true for me as well.
Yeah.
So my final question then, for me, a passion, and this reflects how I got into the industry, because I got into the industry as a student, being asked by a local government to go around and find all their stormwater treatment devices that they'd been building for years and figure out what condition they're in. But I learnt by going out and seeing stuff on the ground and seeing a lot of it on the ground and just intuitively picking up what was going on. So I've got a passion for, learning by going and seeing stuff. For anyone who might randomly be, any Australian who might randomly be coming to the UK, or anyone in the UK who wants to see more of this stuff in the real world, what would be, one or two or a handful of sites, and they can be good or bad if you want to compare and contrast between something that's good and something that's not good. What are a handful of spots that you'd say people should go and have a look at?
Well, it's a very tricky one, because I would say go to our website, but because there's a lot of stuff on the website.
Yeah, you can self-promote. That's okay.
But it's because largely I'm not aware of many other sites which meet the criteria. So if you're looking for some, we are absolutely rigorous that we meet those four pillars, those four criteria standards. Now there are lots of other things. There's a place called Upton in Northampton, which has been, if you like, lauded as an exemplar, but it misses out on water quality. It's also an expensive site. It's not something that can be done very frequently. But that's certainly a site to go and see, and you can see the issues there. There's design issues and also cost issues associated with that sort of thing. As I say, there's now increasing numbers of small sites in London, but nothing that you could sort of, go and have a look at, our website, which is www.sustainabledrainage.com. And so there are schools in Worcestershire, which we could go and see. Sheffield, the Greater Green Project, go to see. Otherwise, it's quite tricky to push you to say, or surely for the sake of argument, the City of Norwich is covered in sites. No, it isn't, because we're still at the stage where we're picking up individual schemes in individual places.
Yeah.
So there's nowhere that has got when I went to Florida, I travelled to Florida, just turn every corner and there'll be swales and basins, what have you.
Right.
And that's not the case. So you can't, there's nowhere to go. You have to find specific sites to go and look at.
Yep.
I mean, little bits of permeable pavement here and there, but specific sites. I'd be hard pressed to tell you where to go to look at good stuff.
Okay.
I could say that about our schemes, but I would say I wouldn't. But for instance, we're the only practice in Britain that I'm aware of who do this as their sole interest.
Gotcha.
So most other professional bodies, so we say landscape architects, there's one in Yorkshire who's doing a lot. They're struggling to get the work because they're not being able to break through this, this ceiling of
That's okay.
answer to the question, I'm afraid.
That's all good. That's all good. You know, you've mentioned a couple of things and mentioned a website people can go and poke around on. So that's a good start. I'm happy with that.
Go to the Susdrain website, SUSDRAIN. That's the Syria website where there are a lot of case studies. So if you go there, you should be able to, and there you can make your own judgments on what constitutes a good and bad site. Because people put examples up, which personally I don't think meet the criteria that I would expect.
Yep. I bet you can learn from both the good and the bad. So.
Well, you don't learn from doing things right. You learn from doing things wrong.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, let's wrap it up there. Bob, thank you for taking the time to have a chat. I've really appreciated it. It's, for me, trying to find as many different perspectives and as many different angles on this and learn from it is great. I'm certainly going to go and look in a little bit more detail at the Welsh experience here. I knew that.
Starting on that road at the moment. So,
but that
was really about a month ago where this was agreed. So we're all looking at it as well.
Yeah, but this is then the prime time to look at it and follow it, so that we don't have to try and diagnose it in 5 years' time and go back and actually ask what was going on. It's the prime time to watch and to observe. So I like it. Thank you for taking the time to have a chat. We'll hopefully talk more in the future, but for now, we'll see you soon. Cheers.
Thanks a lot.
Before you go, our best episodes come from your questions. This knowledge base, these discussions that are Ideanthro improve with your contribution. So if there's a topic, an idea, a concept that you would like us to explore, come and ask us. You know where to find us. www.ideanthro.com/contact. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and that place you get your good podcasts from. You know where to find us. We look forward to hearing from you. We'll see you soon.